So you've learned the moves and the rules of the game. You've learned some basic tactics like the knight fork or a pin with the bishop, and you can even beat your aunt, your uncle, your brother, your sister, the people that taught you how to play chess. Then you decide to maybe go down to the local club or coffee house, and you do okay against some of the people, but you notice there are some players that just never seem to fall for those basic traps. They spot every pin, see every fork, and the opening tricks don't seem to work anymore. You've come to a place in your development where you're beginning to become an intermediate level player. You've passed the beginner level and you've started to enter the intermediate zone. Now, this video is designed for you to help you with some basic principles that are a little more advanced, a little higher level than those entry level, beginner level principles. So, this is an intermediate guide where I'm going to present to you 5 elements of intermediate play that you need to know to become a stronger player. So let us jump right in with number 1, and that is you need to include all of your pieces in the attack. When you're a beginner and you're playing other beginners, usually a queen plus one other piece is enough to win. A queen plus a knight, a queen plus a bishop is usually enough to wipe out someone who isn't very good at the game. But when you approach stronger players, that's not enough. You'll notice the top grandmasters, they include every single piece in the attack. They don't waste a single piece. Always include all of your pieces in the attack. The example we see before us right here in a game from Jovanovic and Hakela is a game that shows white understands that as many pieces as possible must be included in the attack. So we can see here the knight and queen, but that's not enough. Now, if this knight at f6 were not here, let's change that color, then white would have a mate on h7. But how to eject that knight? Well, white found a way to include pieces into the attack to win the game. The first move he played is e5. Now, obviously, this pawn can just be captured, but what he's doing is clearing out this e4 square so that this other knight can get at it. And black can't move the knight or its mate. So pawn takes, and now this great move, knight c to e4. Again, this knight cannot capture on e4, or it will be mate on h7. So black really is forced to take the knight, but after pawn takes knight, then boom, rook takes f6. Another piece enters the attack, eliminating the one defender of the h7 pawn and leading to mate. Black can delay one more move by throwing away the bishop, but after rook takes bishop, we can see mate is inevitable. So as you develop into an intermediate player, you're going to have to include all of your pieces in the attack because your new higher level opponents are simply too good to fall for an attack with just a few pieces. Principle number 2 is always target the weakest point in your opponent's position. Now we know in the starting position, the f square is the weakest point. Most of us at some point in our chess development have fallen for the trap e4, e5, bishop f4, knight c6, queen h5, knight f6, queen f7, mate. I'll ask you to visualize those moves. It helps your training. You've probably fallen for it before. You probably delivered it before because at that point you knew that the f7 square was the weakest square on the board. Well, as the game develops, that weakest square shifts. It doesn't stay at f7. And you have to figure it out in every single position that you're in. What is your opponent's weakest square? And attack it as swiftly and economically as you possibly can. The illustration you see before you is just an exquisite example of chess brilliancy at its finest. White is Vladimir Kramnik, great world champion. Black is Magnus Carlsen, also a great world champion. And you see we have something of a Catalan structure. And it's very common in the Catalan to have pressure down this half-open c-file. And Kramnik made the determination that the weakest square in this position is c6. If he can dominate that c6 square, keep the pawn fixed at c7, then he should be able to squeeze Magnus and win this game without a problem. So he approaches it brilliantly. Watch how quickly he lays siege to the c6 square. Kramnik begins with knight to b3, attacking the a5 square, or the pawn, really, ab, and now he doesn't retake, because black has two ways of recapturing on that square anyway. He plays knight to a5. hitting the bishop at b7, but more importantly, now both of these knights converge on the c6 square. Magnus plays bishop to a8. Now knight a to c6. Bishop takes, knight takes, and of course, you know, with the knight on that square, he's hitting these two pieces, the queen and the bishop. So the queen has to move. Queen to d7, and watch this nice, final, beautiful move from Kramnik. Bishop takes knight, eliminating the last square that can contest the knight at c6. After pawn takes, ab4. And just compare this bishop with this beautiful knight at c6. Kramnik is in complete control and went on to win this game. He identified one square, devoted all of his forces to dominating it, and was able to advance. So in any position we're in, we can find that single square and put as much pressure on it as we possibly can with all of our forces. The third principle is one I think is very important, particularly from a psychological point of view, and that is we need to pick the right side of the board to play on. There are three sectors of the board we can play on: the queen side, the center, or the king side. But beginners in particular tend to want to play on in one zone of the board no matter what the situation is, usually attacking the king. So the position may not call for an attack on the king at all, but they don't care. They just put their pieces over there, and it ends up not working out against good players because the position didn't call for a kingside attack. And we have to find out which side of the board our pieces belong. I even like asking the reverse of that question. What side of the board should I not be playing on? That's a good psychological check against my own bias as a player. Which side do I want to play on? Well, which side does the board say I should be playing on? The position we see in front of us right now is from a game between Alekhine and Maroczy, the same Maroczy that the Maroczy bind is named after. This was a game in 1923. And the best idea for black here is the traditional Slav concept of taking on c4, and after bishop c4, maybe something like b6, building up for a c5 push and just a game. But Maroczy wanted to attack Alekhine's king. The position doesn't call for black to attack the king. You can just see he doesn't even have any pieces near white's king, but he wants to attack the king. So he played the move f5. And after the game, Alekhine expressed that he thought this was, this whole concept was not very, very good. He plays rook a to c1, standard idea in these types of stonewall structures if the c file opens. And here Maroczy plays this shocker, g5. He means business. He's going after that king. This move also shocked Alekhine. But Alekhine said, I have a very simple antidote to this kingside attack that is ill-prepared. I'll just play in the center of the board. So he played knight to d2 with the idea of f3 and e4. After rook f7, f3, e5, cd5, cd5, he played this strong move, e4. And now you have a mess in this center that's about to open up. And look how exposed black's king is and how silly this pawn at g5 looks. And Alekhine went on to win very quickly. We'll just run through those moves. And after rook to f5, he's attacking the d5 pawn, de4, knight e4, queen b4, rook g5, check, and already Maroczy resigned. It took no time at all. If you make a mistake like that against a world champion, it doesn't take long. He chose the wrong side of the board to play on, but remember, you won't make that same mistake. Pick the correct side of the board to play on and put your pieces in that sector. Our fourth principle is that the pawn structure determines the minor piece battle. Knights tend to favor closed and locked positions. Bishops tend to favor open positions. Let's take a look at an example. This was a game where you notice this knight at c5 seems to be well placed, but this knight at b5 is even stronger, even though it's not supported by a pawn at the moment. And white in this game decides to play bishop to e3. The idea is to trade off this well-placed knight because this this locked structure is going to favor the knight over the bishop. So after bishop e7, he goes ahead and chops that knight off of the board. So here we have a knight versus a bishop, but the knight is much better. Even on b5, however, there's an even better square for the knight. Can you identify that? That's right, f5. That knight would radiate power, and the bishop, imprisoned on dark squares, can do nothing about it. After a few moves, and advancing the pawns on the queen side. White decided to reroute his knight very quickly. And then in this position, very simple, knight d1, knight e3, knight f5, king b7, knight h6. And that was it. The knight was stronger than the bishop in the locked position, so white created a position where it was his knight versus his opponent's bishop. Now here we have a different example where the bishop thrives in an open position with pawns on both sides of the board. Now the knight at d5 looks strong, but white can eject it by playing c2, c4, which they do immediately. Kicking the knight away. The knight goes to e7, queen to f3, and mate is already threatened on a8. Queen goes to c6 to block that threat, but now queen takes f7. Queen to c5 check, king to h2, rook to d1. Of course, there's the threat of mate on g1. So white plays a really cool move here. He plays rook to e3, just hanging his rook. But, of course, black cannot take that rook because then queen to e7 check would quickly lead to mate. So that rook cannot be touched. So black plays b5 to sort of maybe get his king away to escape these light squares, which are so dangerous because of this bishop at g2. Queen takes e6, knight to c8, but now a5, taking away that flight square and threatening queen to f7, leading to mate. Queen to c7 prevents that, but queen to e4, renewing the threat of mate on a8. Queen to b8 stops that, but then queen to g4, attacking everything, hitting the rook, preventing the rook from blocking on d7, and hitting the pawn at g7. Jeremy Silman points out another nasty possibility, just queen to e7 check. A queen sacrifice works because this bishop is so strong. If knight takes, rook takes, forcing the queen to block. Discovery and attack. In both of those examples, one minor piece dominated the entire board because the circumstances in the pawn structure favored that minor piece. So pawn structure determines minor piece strength. That's number 4. Number 5, and you've heard this before. You must know basic endgames. I'm not going to show you a basic endgame here, but we're talking about the kind of endgames that you can learn in, the Silman's endgame book and so forth. And these are very important, but maybe not for the reason you think. A lot of people think you need to learn endgames so you can win in the endgame, that you can draw a worse endgame. And you do, but there's another very important reason. Endgame knowledge has a trickle-down effect. So if you're not good at the endgame, you'll end up playing the middle game and opening differently and worse. You might play unsound gambits because you want to avoid the endgame at all costs. You might make a sacrifice. It really isn't a very good sacrifice because you want to avoid the endgame at all costs. It has a trickle-down effect into the other phases of the game. But if you know your basic endgames and you realize pawn structure damage created on move 8 could have relevance in the position on move 68. And it has a literal change in the way you play the game. Studying endgames isn't as fun for some people as it is for others. I get that, but it's an investment well worth your time. So get a book like Silman's Endgame Course, something along that line, and just learn those basic endgames. You don't have to spend forever on them, but if you learn them, it's going to make you a better player in every phase of the game. So these are my 5 recommendations in this intermediate guide. I hope that they serve you well and make you a much stronger player. Have fun, and we'll see you again at Chess Dog. Goodbye.